Yeah, well, let's dig in. Hello, everybody. I'm David Cooks, and I tell you what, we know that paralysis can take on many forms. It can be physical like mine, or it can be psychological. You put your mind to. And what we try to do is feature stories that go from difficult places to fulfilling purpose. What seems impossible can be done by you. This ninth grader had a cumulative grade point average of 0.75. That's 0.75. It may knock you down, but don't let it stop you. But a few teachers never gave up on him. And in 2022, this young man earned his Ph.D. Got so much to give, a lot of life to live. You must go from paralysis to purpose. Get your pen and paper out. Yeah, I'm taking notes. Paralysis to purpose. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Paralysis to Purpose, the podcast. I'm your host, David Cooks, and I say it every week. I love to do this because I get to speak with some of the most intriguing and inspiring people on the planet. Today is no exception, but before I introduce him, as always, I ask you to make sure you like this podcast, share this podcast, tell somebody else about it, because I tell you what, the stories that we have and the people we interview, they're overcoming, they're thriving in spite of difficulties, and you will be inspired by their stories. So thank you for joining us. Our guest today, I saw a post of his on social media that caught my eye. I'm going to read this before I tell you really who he is. It says, this ninth grader had a cumulative grade point average of 0.75. That's 0.75. I want to make that clear. He skipped school every other Friday. Socializing and surviving was more a priority than academic success. But a few teachers never gave up on him. And in 2022, this young man earned his Ph.D. And then I found out a whole lot more. So let me just tell you a little bit about this guy. We'll talk about the fact that he lived in homeless shelters, grew up in a single-parent home in South Norfolk in Virginia. But he went on to get 4 degrees. We just talked about the one. He's got 4. He's got a BS in interdisciplinary studies. He's got a master's in education and learning. He's got a master's in theological studies, and his Ph.D. is in advanced educational leadership. His area of expertise is in education and has a consulting company that's called Purpose Pushers, and he's involved in that as the president and CEO. It's a hybrid educational consulting company, and he does a lot with educational leadership, organizational structure. He's been a teacher of the year before. He was a top 40 under 40 in the Hampton Roads, Virginia area. And he's got a book coming up too. I think it's coming out on July 1st. Dr. Jahkari J.T. Taylor is our guest today. And we're going to talk about the state of education in America. We're going to talk about the digital divide in America and how AI may impact that as well. He's also a pastor. He was an atheist, and he went from believing God wasn't real to understanding God is all I need. Dr. Pastor Jahkari J.T. Taylor, welcome to Paralysis to Purpose, the podcast.
Thank you, David. I'm honored to be here with you. I'm excited about the conversation that we're going to have. And I hope that your listeners can gain something from this talk today that inspires them and motivates them and just provides fuel for their journey as well. Because as a purpose pusher, for me, everything starts with purpose. That's really how my life changed. I started to gain this understanding that my life has meaning, that I'm here for a reason and not to just squander my time. And so I probably took that to the most extreme, my wife would tell you, because I try not to waste any time. I really try to commit to the things that I feel are a priority to me and put my all in it now. But it wasn't always like that, as we can see from the journey. But now purpose is what fuels me.
Talk a little bit about your childhood and your family, because I want to really get to where you were as a ninth grader in high school and some of the things that were a part of that. Because one of the things you talk about when you speak to educators across the country is being culturally responsive and understanding what that means. tell us a little bit about your family and yourself, and then we'll get right into the point 75.
So my childhood is interesting because my family is from New York City. The majority of my family still reside in New York to this day. But when I was younger, probably around 5 or 6, that kindergarten age, my uncle was traveling from New York to Florida, and he was in a horrific car accident. And he wasn't wearing a seat belt. And I mean, he was pretty much thrust through the front windshield. The accident was so horrific. It occurred on the Chesapeake Bay Bridge. So the nearest hospital was either Salisbury, Maryland, or Norfolk, Virginia. Well, the Norfolk Nightingale, the helicopter, flew from Norfolk, Virginia to the Chesapeake Bay Bridge, airlifted my uncle, took him to the hospital. My mother received a call stating that you probably need to come to Virginia because it's not looking too good for your brother. My mother literally just packed my brother up and I, all of our belongings, and we hopped into a 1987 Ford Fairmont. You know, they don't even make those anymore. It was yellow with rusty brown spots, and we nicknamed her Betsy. And we didn't know that Betsy would actually become our home, that we had to live in Betsy for about 3 weeks until my mother found us refuge in a homeless shelter in the city of Norfolk as we were trying to be there for my uncle. We didn't have any family in Virginia. Obviously, we were extremely poor. We didn't have a dime in our bank account, but my mother wanted to be there for her brother. So we relocated to Virginia. And so over time, we ended up moving to the homeless shelter. And literally, I attended school from a homeless shelter during my elementary experience. And I even have images that show how one of my teachers actually purchased me a mat, because at that time we were having nap time in school and I didn't have a mat because, of course, we were homeless. We didn't have any money and all of the kids in the class had a mat. But my teachers purchased me a reversible mat. I'll never forget. It was brown on one side and it was teal on the other side. And they wrote my name and they presented it to me. And I loved that mat. Like it stuck with me forever. And when I became an educator, I often thought back about how they didn't have money because they were educators. And we know educators are not compensated fairly. So I knew that their heart, their love, their compassion, their empathy for me motivated them to buy me that mat. Well, over the course of time, my mother applied for Section 8 housing. We received a federal voucher and we relocated to a tough neighborhood in the South Norfolk borough of Chesapeake. And for our listeners unfamiliar with Virginia and Chesapeake and South Norfolk is the roughest area in the city of Chesapeake. It is the most economically deprived. It is a predominantly African-American and Hispanic community. All of the schools in the South Norfolk borough are Title I schools. So they receive extra funding because they're supporting impoverished young people. I attended those schools throughout my upbringing. When we first moved into the apartment projects, toughest neighborhood around, my brother was jumped on by 3 kids. And I mean, they beat my brother pretty good. He came home and I mean, he was crying and I didn't know what was going on. So I said, "Hey, bro, what's going on?" And he's like, "Man, the kid jumped on me." And literally in that moment, as I was trying to understand what was taking place in this new environment, it was like I can feel my innocence leaving and my aggression switch flipped on. And I knew from that moment, we were going to make it. We were going to survive. Whatever we had to do to survive, I was down for whatever that was. And so I started learning all types of survival skills. That's what I'll call them. Some people will call them aggression. Some people will call them fighting and all. They were survival skills. The problem for me was those skills did not translate in the academic space. So now I'm going to school and I'm aggressive. You know, I'm a little bit loud. I'm boisterous. I'm looking at everybody with the side. I'm trying to be protected. So I often equate that to wearing body armor. I'm coming to school, but I'm guarded. You know, I don't want to let anyone into my bubble. I'm not revealing any softer side of who I am. I'm just a young man who is like a turtle in a shell. And so over time, my academics just continued to just decrease.
When your brother was jumped and you guys were just moving into the projects, how old were you then?
Oh, man, I probably was around 6 or 7. I had to have been in elementary school.
You weren't 13 or 14 years old. You were 6 to 7 years old when you figured out that you were going to have to survive your situation. And based on what you saw is how you responded to it. What was your mom saying during this time? She probably saw you changing from the son you were before you got to Virginia.
Absolutely. It's so crazy because my mother, I tell people all the time, my mother's love for me was so unconditional. And my mother was very protective. So her response was, y'all not going back outside. She was going to try to protect us and kind of shelter us from the environment, but it was impossible. We had to go outside. We had to be kids. And so literally my brother and I, we asked my mom, we're like, hey, can you buy us boxing gloves? Literally that Christmas, my mother purchased us boxing gloves, and my brother and I, we're literally sparring and boxing in the house. We're watching all types of boxing on TV. We just started loving boxing because we knew we were going to have to box. And so what we ended up doing was, once the kids from the neighborhood saw us outside boxing and stuff, they came over and they're like, hey, can we box? And so we're like, yeah, put the gloves on. And so that's how we were trying to show them, like, hey, don't mess with us. Because once we start tagging a couple of people, then they knew, like, hey, man, those guys are cool. They let us box. So that actually was a way for us to develop pro-social relationships in the community, because we had to show people, like, hey, man, this is what we willing to do if y'all want to do that. One thing my mother embedded in us as young people, she talked to us about becoming a statistic. When we didn't even understand what that language meant, we're like, Mom, why do you keep saying you're not going to become a statistic? That's one thing I remember from my childhood, my mother's unconditional love. She always tried to spend time with us and nurture us and, take us to different places. Even though we didn't have a lot of money, we would go for walks down Waterside or on the beach, and we would spend that quality time.
You have a brother and he got jumped. How did he handle the transition as well? Because you're seeing it and figured out what you have to do. But there's always, I call it the trauma spillover effect, where I may not have directly been involved in it, but because someone so close to me I got affected. How was he with that? And was he able to help you kind of get through that? Or how did you guys work together for that?
Yeah, so my brother is 1 year older than me. So he's my older brother. But ironically, we responded in two different ways. Literally, he responded by becoming more of a hermit crab. Like, he actually didn't go outside as much. My brother became infatuated with reading and academics. My brother was actually in gifted and talented education during elementary school. I, on the other hand, saw what he experienced, and now I went the complete opposite way. I was the guy out in the streets. I was the aggressive one, because I felt like, even though he was my bigger brother, because of his personality, he is more introverted. For me, I'm more outspoken. So I took it like, whatever I got to do, I'm going to do that. I'm going outside. They're just going to have to try me, and I'm just going to have to teach them lessons along the journey. And so my brother, on the other hand, he wasn't as outspoken. He was really focused on games. He was a gamer. Game Boys, back then, Game Boys, Sega, Genesis, Dreamcast, and Nintendo. He was a gamer. Me, I was like, I'm going to the basketball court. I don't care who's out there, So that was me. We went two different ways with that.
So let's talk about high school. You said in your post that you had a 0.75 GPA, and that's pretty hard to do. I've taught high school for 17 years, and to not have a whole number in front of your grade point average is not something that I regularly saw. How did you get to that point, and when did you realize that you needed to do better?
Middle school is really where I got lost in the sauce. I started hanging out with a different group of friends. I didn't hang out with the guys in my neighborhood. I hung out with some guys from another neighborhood. My neighborhood was mostly athletes. They loved sports. They were doing what they needed to do academically because they were all trying to play sports. But the guys who I started hanging out with in middle school, they weren't athletes. They were about fashion. They were about money. They were about girls and those type of things. And so once I started affiliating with that group of young people, that's where I kind of got lost. And so after 8th grade and into my 9th grade year, I was the youngest guy out of all of the guys that I was hanging with. So these guys were trying to go to the mall. They were like, hey, we're skipping school day. We're going to the mall. You coming? I'm like, yeah. And so my mother, a single parent, she's going to work in the morning before the bus comes. So me, I go to the bus stop as if I'm going to school. My mother waving to my mom as she leaves. And then the guys will come and pick me up and we will go to the mall. And so I was really not trying. I really didn't go to school. And when I went to school, I was skipping class because back in those days, they didn't have like a parameter on how much time you could spend in the hallway. So I would go to class and ask for a bathroom pass. And I literally would roam the halls all day long and just cut class. So that's how my GPA took such a hit. Physical education was the only class that I didn't cut. I was going to PE because we were playing basketball and football, and that was my socialization time. But school for me during that ninth grade year was equivalent to NBA players getting announced before the game starts. They come off the bench and they giving everybody high fives. That was high school for me. I got off of the bus and I literally walked down the hall just dapping up and shaking hands with all of the guys from the neighborhood. And so that's how my GPA hit that 0.75. But it was my sophomore year that really woke me up. And the craziest thing happened. I had a few friends of mine during my sophomore year who had purchased a yearbook at the end of my freshman year. I couldn't afford a yearbook. I didn't get a yearbook. I didn't know what was in a yearbook. They came to me during my sophomore year and they're like, hey, Jay, I thought you said you're a sophomore. And I said, I am a sophomore. This is my second year. They showed me the yearbook and pointed to my picture. And they said, why are you in the ninth grade section of the yearbook during my sophomore year? So it was in that moment where I realized, oh, this is serious. I was so embarrassed because I guess it didn't process that, hey, you failed everything. You're a ninth grader again during your sophomore year, and it's in the yearbook. It was in that moment that I said, oh, this is real. I need to get out of this situation. I need to improve my academics. I need to come to school and do some work. And at the same time, what was happening was our school had just hired a new football coach. His name is Richard Morgan. Coach Morgan came from New York. He was on a mission to change the culture in the athletic department because at that time, my high school was the worst in football. He was a PE teacher. He saw me in the gym and I was killing kids in PE because I was a tremendous athlete, had been an athlete my entire life. But of course, I was academically ineligible, so I couldn't play any sports for school. But he sees me and he comes to me and says, hey, why aren't you playing football? And I was like, I don't know. He was like, well, I need you to try out. Do you have a 2.0 GPA? I said, I don't think I have that. And so he was like, well, you need to get a 2.0. And so that year after that conversation, I started to say, okay, I want to play football. Let's go. If he believes I can play, you need to try it. So I started buckling down, doing my work. I remember that summer of my sophomore year, I actually attended summer school and I was taking as many classes that you could take because I had to retake the classes that I kept failing. And so that's how I finally got my GPA up to a 2.0. And literally, I tried out for the team my junior year, end up making the team and gaining a starting position. And the coach was basically persuading me that, hey, man, you're a leader in the school. Everyone knows you. They respect what you have to say. I need you to use your influence to help the school out. So he challenged me to a more leadership identity. And that's what kind of helped me on my journey as well. From that moment, that's where the change started. But I also met some amazing educators who I call teachers with a purpose, like my English teacher, Miss Patricia Bookman. She believed in me. She articulated that. She held me to high expectations. She was responsive to me. That's why I'm on a mission to help educators become culturally responsive, because I was a hip hop connoisseur at that time of my life. And I still love hip hop to this day. But at that time, I was so infatuated with Nasir Jones as a rapper that one day Ms. Bookman had given us a biography assignment. And she's like, you got to conduct a biography on one of these individuals. So she had given us a list of individuals to research. But I was like, I don't want to research any of these guys. I want to research Nasir Jones. And she was like, well, who was that? And I said, well, if you let me conduct my research on him, you're going to learn everything you need to learn about the rapper named Nas. So she empowered me to do that, gave me the opportunity. And that was literally the first time that I rushed home to complete homework. I remember staying up, reading everything about Nas and his brother and his family and how they were from Queensbridge and how his first album was released when he was a young man, a teenager. And so that gave me a passion for academics. I'll never forget when I submitted that assignment and we had to read before the class, and I read before the class and the class just clapped for me and it celebrated me. And it was like, I thought to myself, man, you can do this academic stuff. Stop playing and actually start doing the work. And that really was the beginning of my journey where I said, I want to do academic stuff. And so that Miss Bookman, I credit her with helping me academically for sure.
That's an amazing story. And when we come back, I want to pick up again on Miss Bookman and talk a little bit about her insight that allowed for you to stay interested in something you were interested in for a greater purpose. She empowered you. She allowed for you to be a free thinker. And I think that makes a difference. We're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, we're going to hear a little bit more about his high school career, but then we're going to transition into higher learning, some of the things he's doing now, and also about his faith, because that changed as well. So we'll be right back on Paralysis to Purpose, the podcast, with our guest, Dr. Jahkari J.T. Taylor. We'll be right back.
We hope you're enjoying Paralysis to Purpose, the podcast. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok at Paralysis to Purpose for more updates. Also, check out David's website at davidcookspeaks.com to learn more about his mission and purchase his book, Getting Undressed, From Paralysis to Purpose.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Paralysis to Purpose, the podcast. We left off talking about the impact of a teacher and a football coach on our guest today. And I want to pick it up from there and talk a little bit about that, because in a lot of the stories that are similar to our guest, there was somebody somewhere that believed in them. And his football coach was like, yeah, you're a great football player, but you're also a leader, which expanded his mind into doing other things. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of mentorship and having someone like that in your life?
Absolutely. And now it's interesting because last year I coached 32 principals across the nation, and I engaged them in executive coaching. And one of the things that I explained to leaders about the concept of coaching and mentorship in the professional world is everybody can learn from somebody. Especially if, you're coachable, you're open, you're willing to be vulnerable and transparent. You can go as far as you desire to go if you have coaches and mentors. And so I'm a firm believer in coaches and mentors because I think it adds another layer of accountability. And that mentorship is just beneficial in so many ways. I've always had tremendous coaches. Even when I played Pop Warner football, all of my coaches were instrumental to me because they taught me character traits. They taught me leadership. They taught me persistence and perseverance and, hard work and determination and teamwork. And so, as you stated, sometimes a second set of eyes can just help you see things that you just would not have seen, or you just would not have identified as a trait that you actually have. That's what I try to do in the work that I'm in the field that I'm in now, is pull out the greatness that lays dormant in people. Sometimes they're just blinded to it, and a coach can help you see what you actually have inside of you.
So did you play athletics in college?
I did. Unfortunately, I only graduated my high school with a 2.1 GPA because I had to dig myself out of that deep hole from that 0.75. And people ask me all the time, like, man, how did you get to college? And I'm like, you know what's so crazy? If I hadn't played sports, I wouldn't have had an opportunity. In fact, during my senior year, my coach came to me at the end of the year. I had won, all district awards and Mike Hill wide receiver of the year and different things like that. But because of my GPA and because I was what they call a late bloomer, I only played my junior and senior year. I wasn't heavily recruited. So I had about 2 or 3 colleges that were showing interest in me. And one of them was Christopher Newport University, which the average GPA at that school was like 3.7 or something. It was like some ridiculously high GPA, but they were recruiting me to come play football. And literally, when I got accepted and I got to the campus, my wide receiver coach, he pulled me into his office and he said, "Hey, JT, the only reason you are here is because I went and had a conversation with the president of the university, and I pleaded with them to accept you because of how your GPA looked during your senior year and your junior year as opposed to your freshman year. He said, and I told him that this young man can do the work. His GPA doesn't tell the whole story of how intelligent he is. And so even that experience made me realize that young people have to understand you don't have time to waste, because if I hadn't had an advocate for me at that university, I would have never made it into college in the first place. But because of another coach who believed that I could maintain the academic rigor, they afforded me the opportunity to get there. I knew I was going to make the best of that opportunity.
To go from a 0.75 to a cumulative of a 2.1, that's a really big number. I don't know if people know the magnitude of how hard that is, because everything is cumulative. You don't get to erase all those failures. The importance of opportunity and having an advocate. That was very well said, because you could have missed out and could have settled for something less from an academic standpoint for your college career, because you would have just had to without an advocate, without someone who actually measured progress and not GPA. And that's a very different kind of educational understanding. How far has he come? What is his growth? What has he learned? What is he showing that's sustainable? You were showing character traits and work ethic traits that were going to be sustainable at any level. And thankfully, man, you had a coach that not only saw your talent on the field, but saw the talent in your mind that you were going to be able to do in the classroom.
Even as you highlight these individuals along my journey, from Mrs. Bookman to Coach Morgan to Coach Driscoll in college, all of these things actually played a role in my faith, because I started to internalize. It seems as if on my journey, I had somebody every step along the journey who believed in me. When I didn't believe in myself, I had someone who was like divinely positioned to help me understand what I was capable of accomplishing in the world. And they believed in my gifts. They believed in my intelligence. They believed in my leadership. So that's why I tell people it was a cumulative effect that caused me to actually change. I wasn't fully changed when I got to college, but I met individuals at college that also played a role, spoke life into me, challenged me to increase my academics, and all of those things in combination helped me to become who I am today.
Here on Paralysis to Purpose, we always talk about the journey. And we always say this here, that no one's journey is ever linear. Yeah. It's going to be curves and ups and downs and mistakes and victories. All of that is part of the journey, though, that can get you from a place of paralysis where you were literally in a paralyzed state where you potentially would not have been able to get out. But there were people along the way and some other things that happened. And I agree. I think that there are people that are assigned to your purpose. While you were in college, you went in as a self-proclaimed atheist.
It's crazy when I look back on it, because literally I just didn't believe in God because of the destitute situation that my family was in, because of what I saw in my community in terms of a lack of resources, a lack of compassion. I just couldn't fathom the concept of God. It just didn't resonate that there was a just, holy, righteous, loving God who I could have access to. I just couldn't fathom that. But while I was in college, during my sophomore year at college, my suite mates, we were in our suite one day, really just chilling. And someone knocked at the door. It was two girls, two sophomores. They're like, hey, we're getting ready to go to Bible study. Anybody want to come? I'm like, please leave my dorm room. I'm not trying to, get it. I don't believe in that stuff. And so one of my suite mates went, and he came back and he was telling us about how everything went. He was like, yeah, those girls, they wear promise rings. They're committing to saving their virginity. I'm just mind blown about how these individuals were living their lives. Nothing had changed for me from a believing in God standpoint until that summer of my sophomore year. I went home. So let me rewind. My first son was born in high school. My freshman year of college, my second son was born. So here I am. I'm 18 years old and I'm the father of two boys. So I'm already at college under tremendous pressure because I vowed that my children would never have the experience that I had being raised by a single parent. So every weekend, I would literally leave college to come home and spend time with my boys. So ironically, at the end of my sophomore year, I come back home and I'm back at my mom's house in the neighborhood in which I grew up, the toughest neighborhood or what have you. And I go to the basketball court, which everybody in the neighborhood always spends time at the basketball court. First day back from college, everybody like, hey, Jay, man, good to see you playing football, da, da, da. And we're playing, a full court game of basketball, and it's an aggressive game. There's no referees out there. So, you got to call your own fouls and all of that. Well, it was some guys who weren't from my neighborhood who were there, and they were playing aggressive. And so one of the guys from my neighborhood said, hey, man, don't do that again. Don't foul me like that again, or it's going to be problems. Well, it ended up happening. A guy from my neighborhood literally ran to his house and he went and got a weapon. And everybody was like, hey, Jay, we got to go. I wasn't that familiar with this guy because since I was at college, all of these guys, I didn't really know them like that. But this is my community. All the people there like, Jay, come on, we got to go because this could escalate. It's going to get serious. He comes back with the weapon and he's literally shooting at the guys. And everybody scatters from the court and I book all the way home and I get home and I'm sitting on my bed and I said to myself, what in the world is going on? You have left college and now you're back home and your life could end in this situation. So I literally closed my door because I began to weep profusely. I began to weep uncontrollably. I didn't know what was happening to me, but I locked my door because I didn't want my mother, I didn't want my brother, I didn't want anyone to see what was happening to me. And in that moment, I said to myself, if God is real, I need him to do something with my life. I didn't know how to pray. I had never prayed in my life, but I was a student, so I knew how to type. I grabbed my laptop and I began to type a letter and it was titled, Dear God. And I just explained everything that I was going through in life, how I was a father of two. I was unemployed. I'm going through so many issues. I just witnessed an attempted murder. And I'm like, this is horrible. And God, if you're real, I need you to do something with my life. And literally 2 weeks later, I go to a cookout in another neighborhood. My best friend, he's graduating high school. He got a full scholarship to Norfolk State. He's about to be the starting quarterback there. And his dad is hosting this event at his house to celebrate his achievement. I go to celebrate with him and I see a middle-aged white lady in this dangerous neighborhood. And I'm thinking to myself, what is she doing here? She doesn't know this is a dangerous area. When I get closer, it's actually my principal, who was the principal when I graduated. And I'm like, Dr. Andraco. She said, hey, JT, how's it going? I say, it's going great. Good to see you. She said, are you still at Christopher Newport? I said, I'm actually getting ready to transfer to Norfolk State because I got to be closer to home to support my children. I got two boys. She said, yeah, I heard. And she said, well, okay, but what are you doing with yourself? I said, well, I'm struggling. I need a job. I need some income. I need to be able to take care of my boy. And she said, well, have you applied for Chesapeake Public Schools? And I said, no, ma'am. She said, well, you need to apply and I'll see what I can do. I went home that day and applied for a custodial position. I got a call back about 2 weeks later and they wanted to interview me for a position. When I got there, they said, we want to interview you not for a custodial position, but for a para-educator position. We want you to be a teacher assistant. I said, okay, well, what do they make? And they're like, well, look, you get medical and healthcare benefits and stuff. I said, sign me up. I'll do that. My kids will have medical and dental and all this. And so I ended up getting the job and I came home that day and I remember sitting on my bed thinking to myself, maybe that prayer was answered. Maybe that prayer that you prayed sparked your life starting to come in order. And maybe God, who you didn't believe in, is now orchestrating your life. And so I went to my computer and I opened up my laptop and I began to read the letter again. And the last two lines of the letter said, if you do anything for me, I promise to go to church every chance I get. And I said, what did you do? Now you got to go to church every chance you get. And so I did. My girlfriend at the time, who is now my wife, Ironically, her father is a pastor. Him and I weren't on the best relationship at that time because I had got his daughter, his princess, pregnant as a teenager. And so I go to church and I'm sitting in the back and he's teaching and preaching about developing a personal relationship with God. And so that's what resonated with me. And I just became in love with God and in love with the Bible and all of these things. And so after I got my first master's, I said, man, God is calling you to seminary. You need to go and learn how to study the Bible and understand it in its proper context and all of these different things. So that's what led me to go to seminary. And after seminary, I'm still serving under his leadership at his church. And I was a minister at that time. And he's like, well, we're going to ordain you as an elder. And from the beginning, I kept telling him, I don't want any of those titles. I just want to be a student, because that my identity was a student. I just like learning and I like writing. So I would write little sermons and write little messages to preach, but I never had an opportunity. And so eventually he started giving me opportunities and I fell in love with it. And so I went and got my seminary degree. And then probably like 2 years later, I felt God calling me to start a church from scratch, to plant a church from scratch. And so that's what my wife and I did. Now we're in year 8 of the Focus Church. And it's been a beautiful thing. We're a community-based church. We serve the community. We've had Chromebook giveaways for the last 3 years, free pizza and tutoring for high school students. We have served schools and we've purchased lunch for teachers during Teacher Appreciation Week. We are rooted in community work. Our vision statement is literally transforming our community. So that's the work that I've been committed to, and just trying to inspire other people around me to commit to that work too, because communities need help. They need individuals who believe in them. And so I just try to pay it forward. I'm so mindful of those individuals who connected with me, believed in me, and inspired me to be better. And I'm on a mission to do that for everyone I come in contact with. So that's how the journey has been.
That's an amazing story. A couple of things stood out to me. One, you typed a letter to God. And I think that's so significant that sometimes we try to put how you come to God in a box.
Yes.
And as you better do it this way, or you better do it that way. And you knew how to type. And so that's what you did. And you just took what you knew and you put it out there for him. And the rest is history, so to speak. The other thing that is interesting is that the Christian faith should be a communal one. It's being made more into a personal one, but there was always community involved in the faith. And the fact that you have such a passion and also an execution of serving the poor and the needy and clothing the naked and all of those things that we probably read over and think it's spiritual, but no, you need to do these things.
Absolutely.
God uses all your gifts and talents because he gives them all to you to be used. And Absolutely. That's exactly what you're doing. I want to just spend a little bit of time on a couple of topics and see where we can go with that. What is the state of education in America, in your view?
The state of education in America is honestly heartbreaking. I'll talk about 2 areas that breaks my heart. First, I'll start with student achievement. When we compare America's educational achievement to other what we would consider to be industrialized countries with a tremendous economic output or outlook, we're not anywhere close to the top 5, top 10. We're in that middle tier. Students are not achieving at a high level, and neither have they been for quite some time. Literacy rates in America have been dwindling for the last couple of decades. They were accelerated and exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. So now when students didn't have access to highly effective in-person instruction, academics declined even more. And so student achievement right now is abysmal in our country, and particularly in Black and brown communities across the country, which is my expertise. I was a Title I instructional coach prior to being a consultant. So I look at the lens of student achievement, and there's no doubt in my mind that these young people are brilliant. So their achievement is not indicative of their intelligence. They literally have my story. They're not demonstrating high academic output, but it doesn't mean that their brilliance is absent. We're just not able to tap into it and motivate them and inspire them to believe in their brilliance. So that's why it's heartbreaking for students. They're not prepared for the world. The second area that's heartbreaking is for educators. The first book that I have ever written was titled Overcoming Burnout. And that book is about helping educators overcome stress, job-related stress. And so teacher attrition, what we call the revolving door of educators leaving the field of education, is at pandemic levels in American education. There are schools right now in the month of April that are still not fully staffed. There are some schools that young people have passed through elementary, middle school, and high school where they haven't had fully staffed, qualified educators. They've been being taught by long-term subs who don't have the credentials, which means they don't have the instructional skill set, the pedagogical posture to actually move the academic needle. And so because we're not getting young people to go into education and we're not retaining quality educators, it doesn't look good for the state of education for the future. So every school and district across the country has to grapple with retaining educators, not just recruiting them, which we got to do a better job of that, but we got to retain them. So for those reasons, student achievement and retaining educators, the state of education in America is heartbreaking. That's the only way I can describe it.
So from a solution standpoint, you talk about retaining educators. The first thing comes to mind, pay them. I'm a simple guy. And I know that you talked about the burnout and all of that, and that's real. And that's even greater in less affluent neighborhoods. Money doesn't solve all your problems, but it does solve your money problems. And that does reduce some of the stress that I think academic.
Absolutely. As we know, if we looked at data when it comes to like divorce rates in our country, one of the top reasons why people get divorced is because of financial instability. When we look at education and we look at burnout among teachers, we got to understand it's not just the job. It's the pay and how the pay reduces the quality of life, which adds to stress. It's so many areas of life that are impacted by your economics. So I agree with you wholeheartedly. We have to pay educators better to prove to them that they are valuable. We can't expect them to do all of these great things and then throw them pennies and say, hey, thank you for your day's work. It's unacceptable.
I'm married to an educator and I spent over 25 years in education myself. The job doesn't end when the bell rings at the end of school. You're correcting papers, you're doing planning. You are done at about 9 o'clock at night.
Exactly. So I taught special ed for 10 years, was a Title I instructional coach for a couple of years, and then now I'm a full-time educational consultant. My wife became an educator as well. So my wife is now a principal of an elementary school. So all we know is education. And she is up late at night preparing, planning, responding to emails. So to your point, the job doesn't stop. It doesn't stop.
You touched on it a little bit, and I want to talk about the digital divide in America, because COVID really magnified that as well. And by digital divide, I'm talking about discrepancies in access to technology, which is the future, and how that has impacted disproportionately areas that are, again, less affluent. And now we have AI coming in, and in certain communities, they're embracing it and moving forward with it as a tool of development. And then in other communities, it's left out. What are your observations about that?
I'm a proponent of educational equity. I believe in fairness. I believe in providing students with access to what they need. We serve a predominantly impoverished community. So we knew that the young people didn't have access to Chromebook technology during the COVID pandemic, and neither did their parents. So now the parents can't even effectively monitor what's taking place in the school and respond appropriately to the emails because they don't have access to it. And the young people can't read, can't conduct their math assignments because they don't have access to technologies. Nowadays, schools are moving toward the concept of which is called one-to-one, which is ensuring that every child has access to some type of technology device, a Chromebook, a laptop, or something like that. And so we are starting to wake up to that. But here's the issue, David. Just because you give a person a Chromebook doesn't mean they have access to internet.
Right.
So now we have to find ways to make internet access available to people in these communities who might be underprivileged and underserved. Then when you start talking about AI, ChatGPT, these opportunities that can actually accelerate learning and accelerate performance, we need to start having these conversations in these communities. this is where my research comes in about being culturally responsive. So when we're talking about being culturally responsive, we're talking about responding to culture. We're talking about responding to communities. We're talking about responding to families, responding to students. It's literally a student-centered approach. And so how to be culturally responsive, you learn what are the lived experiences? What are the realities of young people? What are their aspirations? What are they interested in? What do they want to do? And then we seek to frame the educational conversation and frame the resources and provide the resources that are responsive to the needs of the people we want to reach. And so if we see that the digital divide is impacting other communities at a more alarming rate, then that's where we as educators and officials have to move in to provide access to those things so that the achievement gaps, the gaps in quality of life aren't exacerbated, particularly in underserved communities. And so again, we have to make the observation that you have made, and then we have to respond with real solutions. That's the only way forward.
Lastly, this is an interesting question. And there is so much debate right now, gender declarations, critical race theory, woke versus unwoke. How do you navigate through all of that and position educators, because they're the ones that really are trying to juggle through this, to find a lane that you can walk in the DEI space that is constantly changing? Because I think that's part of the burnout.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Oh, man, you hit the nail on the head. In my book that I'm getting ready to release on July 1st, it is titled Becoming Culturally Responsive Educators. And in that book, I lay out 5 necessary steps that I believe every educator must take. And the first step is developing historical awareness. And so what I mean by that is we have to have an understanding of history. We have to know, how did we get here? How do we get to a point where teachers are burning out? How do we get to a point where African-American and Hispanic students and other students of color are underperforming? How do we get to this point? So you have to understand history, the role history has played to create the current educational context. And so once you have an understanding of historical awareness, you'll know that the foundations were actually inequitable and that there were people who couldn't go to school, that there were things such as anti-literacy laws that made it illegal to teach people of color how to read and write. Once you understand the historical journey that we've been on as a nation, now you have more fuel to understand why we need to be culturally responsive. Secondly, you have to foster what I call multicultural consciousness. Now, multicultural consciousness is defined as awareness of self. So you have to understand who you are, how you became who you are. What were your lived experiences? What have your past and experiences been in school? Did you attend diverse institutions? Do you have individuals who you spend time with who don't look like you, who don't come from similar backgrounds like you? You have to develop what's called knowledge of difference. I need to be knowledgeable of the fact that I'm different from the students, that I'm different from my colleagues because of my own lived experiences. And then thirdly, I got to seek to develop interpersonal dispositions toward diverse individuals. I can't assume that I'm only going to associate with people who share the same cultural background or racial identity as me along my journey. I got to be prepared to socialize with whoever I meet. So I need to have the right disposition and right attitudes. Thirdly, you got to become culturally responsive and apply those principles. You have to actually put some things in place. And so there are steps that we have to take because the socio-political climate right now is an ever-evolving thing. And as you have alluded to, it's very difficult for most educators to navigate these spaces because they don't have historical awareness, because they didn't foster multicultural consciousness. So they're easily swayed when the media tries to pit each individual against another individual for cultural or racial factors. Those things are just distractions. And so for me, I try to lead with my heart. I feel like as long as I'm doing what's best for children, I will always resonate with those who are doing what's best for children. Now, if someone comes along and they have a different agenda, a different motive, they don't really want to do what's best for children, then automatically we're probably going to be at odds because they're not going to see my work as value because they actually don't want to do what's best for each child. I became teacher of the year working with students who have emotional and behavioral disabilities. So I proved that the kids who everyone thought were the bad kids who were less likely to succeed, once I proved that they can succeed at a high level, it was just confirmation for me. Now I can't go to any school and listen to a deficit narrative where they're like, oh, well, these kids can't do it. No one can tell me that. I had a 0.75. I work with kids who were considered the worst. So now it's like I've learned that the goal is changing mindsets. It is helping adults recognize that young people are inherently brilliant. They just need what I call purpose pushers. They just need cultivators. They just need individuals who believe in them, and they'll work to ensure that success is the only option. When you have that type of community around young people, they will succeed.
I think one of the things that educators and society in general does not fully grasp is the generational aspect of non-access. As an African-American man, one of my frustrations with the educational system is the lack of addressing the wealth gap. And I have said this, and I will continue to say this, the inability to have curriculum changed when it comes to African-Americans is baffling when in recent times, in the last 5 years, we've seen a whole curriculum of gender and other things come into our schools. And I'm not saying that that's not an important issue. I'm just saying, as someone who's Black, and keep hitting these roadblocks, if we can teach our kids to understand the new language and the new pronouns, we can teach them about the stock market also in kindergarten, first, second, third grade. Where is that conversation being held at, or is it?
Oh, man, you're on it, David. You're on it. I mean, the conversation is not being had. And that's why, again, I'm advocating for culturally responsive schooling. And so what that means is we see what the students need, what the communities need, and then we put that in place. To your point, and in the state of Virginia, we've just got to a place where we're teaching financial literacy. But here's the crazy thing. It's only one course. It's called Economic and Personal Finance. By the time you get to that course, you're a junior in high school. You haven't had any experience with learning about credit and debt management and economic prosperity and the stock market. You're not going to learn about those things. Right. That is another tragedy of the educational system. We're not responding to the needs of this generation. We're not responding to the unique needs of communities. That's why I'm advocating for culturally responsive schools. Like you said, you're not in the current school system today, but you can make an observation and you can see that, hey, the kids they haven't learned about AI yet.
We'll just leave it at that. And I just think that as educators and as school systems, we really need to rethink what we should be majoring on and what we should be minoring in. Until we get to that point, some of the things that actually need to get done are now being leapfrogged by other issues, agendas, whatever you want to call them, that may not be appropriate anyway for processing at a very young age.
Unfortunately, those conversations are deemed divisive to the extent that no one talks about it because there's such heated conversations. But to your point, we need to talk about these things. The other thing I'll say is, because I'm an educational researcher, I think we need to focus on the research. We need to look at studies that's being done, because when we don't look at these studies, we're making assumptions about the readiness of young people to have conversations that may not be appropriate for their age. So what we tend to see is a few individuals who are passionate about whatever it is that they're passionate about, and they have been given a platform or opportunity to share their voice, and they share their voice. We need to have conversation about those things. We have to be more understanding of everyone.
It points to the importance of communication. And if we can't talk to each other, there will never be an opportunity to grow together. We've created an environment, a society that's so sensitive, they're afraid they're going to say the wrong thing. Instead of being canceled, they're just not going to say anything. It's another one of those things where this does not make common sense because it's causing us to stop talking to each other.
You have just alluded to the educational state of paralysis. We can't move from paralysis to purpose because folks are unwilling to have conversations out of fear. Fear has paralyzed the conversation, and now we can't even have a meaningful dialogue and see another person's perspective. Because I think each perspective needs to be heard. Those who might be for a certain thing and those who might be against that thing. We can talk. We can agree to disagree and still say, hey, we're a community. We still have love for one another. We're still aiming to do what's best for everyone, but we should not be expected to agree or be silent. That defeats the purpose of a dialogue.
I worked 17 years in the diversity space, and I always said that diversity really is not inclusive, because if it was inclusive, it would be inclusive.
Diversity means different. That's what it's supposed to be. So we should have different opinions, should be welcomed and not pushed to the margins, whatever those differences are. We have to learn to be more understanding and to really be more collaborative and more team oriented, that together each accomplishes more. We're not going to always agree. Anytime two people occupy the same space, conflict is inevitable. But conflict is not necessarily a bad thing. You know, only conflict that I would deem to be inappropriate is when it's emotionally charged, because emotion overpowers logic. But as long as we're able to make logical choices and hear one another out, even if our approaches are conflicting, it shouldn't divide us. We should listen to the conflict and learn and grow from it. So we have to make space for that.
We covered a lot of things today. And before we go, I ask each of our guests on Paralysis to Purpose, the podcast, to tell me what they think of when they hear these words, because we always talk about the importance of perspective, perseverance, and partnerships that help us get from paralysis to purpose. So when you hear the word perspective, what comes to mind to you?
The glass is half full or half empty. How you see life is completely up to you. You can choose to major on the minors, or you can choose to be defeated. You can choose to have a victim mindset. It's up to you. Or you can choose to be prosperous, and you can choose to be a victor. You can choose whatever it is that you want to accomplish. That's perspective. It drives everything.
Perseverance.
Perseverance, the most necessary character trait in all of humanity. Regardless of the ups and downs, the trials and tribulations, you must persevere. You must understand, as the Bible would teach us, that this too shall pass. Weeping may endure for a night, but joy comes in the morning. You just got to keep pushing. You just got to never give up. You got to persevere.
Partnerships.
Partnerships, critical. You have to embrace this mindset. To your earlier point, we're communal. We're interdependent, not dependent, not independent, interdependent. I need you and you need me, and we got to work this thing out together through an effective partnership relationship.
Well, it's been a great conversation, and that's what we like to have here. The conversation. Your story is impactful, and the work that you're doing is impactful as well. If people wanted to follow you, what is the best way for them to do that?
Well, first and foremost, I just want to say thank you, David, for the invitation. I have completely enjoyed this dialogue. This was overdue for me. So I'm just grateful that this was a divinely inspired opportunity and we were able to do this. If anyone's looking to get in contact with me, they could visit my website at www.purposepushers.com or follow me on any social media platform at Purpose Pushers.
All right, there we have it. Thank you so much for joining us today. And this is David Cooks reminding you, until the next episode of Paralysis to Purpose, that your ability to endure is always greater than your willingness to endure.
You can do anything you put your mind to.
Thanks for tuning in to Paralysis to Purpose. Don't forget to follow us on social media at Paralysis to Purpose on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok. To purchase his book, visit davidcookspeaks.com. Be sure to tune in next time for more inspiring conversations with David Cooks.
So money is a tool for helping you do what you want to do in life. And when we make that switch, as it's not something to just acquire, it's something that is going to help us accomplish what's really important to us. That's a huge mental shift that a lot of people are missing, is they don't realize that they can design what they want out of life.
Next time on Paralysis to Purpose.
Our guest today is Ryan Schechner.
Most people just default into life and they follow the program. And it doesn't have to be that way.
Paralysis to purpose.